Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for that introduction. And before you head off, let me again join what I know is going to be a long series of thanks for the great leadership that you have provided George Washington for the last decade. So, Steve, congratulations. Let me also thank the Scotts and for their vision 9 years ago to start this competition. Recognize my good friend Anna Maria Tannen, who I actually was an entrepreneur. I married her and her husband, so you know I'm now showing up in my entrepreneur role. I had a tie, had my politician role. I took it off and so I could be an entrepreneur. But being a politician, you know, you can sometimes be an entrepreneur. I've also married 11 people as governor or senator, and I'm 11-0 in terms of my record. So you know, if things go bad, but. This is really remarkable. I've heard about this competition. I can assure you, back when I was at GW and graduated in 1977, we didn't have innovation, entrepreneurship were basically foreign terms at a school that was, at that point, and I'm proud to be an alumnus and proud to be a supporter of the university, but it was pretty much a straight path either towards politics or towards law school or towards medical school. The idea that you could go out and be an entrepreneur, especially in this community, was a very new phenomenon. And I should say, though, that I want to congratulate again the Scotts for having the idea and for all the teams and the judges. It is never a straight line. When we were talking again about sometimes these introductions, and Steve was kind enough to give mine, and it sounds like it was a straight line, did business, did politics. The truth is, and I've invested in literally hundreds of entrepreneurs, I have never, ever invested in an entrepreneur that ever met his or her original business plan. It is the ones who make it are the ones who can shift, who can understand changing complexity, that realize that no matter how smart they may be, you're much better as a team. I've never seen a successful venture that was only driven by a single entrepreneur. No one has all the skills. And it really is this notion of entrepreneurship and innovation, which I again commend GW for what they're doing now. And Jim, all the great work that you talked about in terms of at the Innovation Center, boy, oh boy, we could have used that back in the 70s, is really remarkable. But let me start with the notion, at least a little bit about my story. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. I came here to kind of work in politics and went off to law school afterwards and went to Harvard for law school, got out, and decided I'd come back and do politics. After doing 2 years of politics in 80 and 81, decided I'd go and be an entrepreneur. And let me caveat all this by saying, as somebody who came from a kind of middle class, lower middle class family, I got out of college and law school with a combined $15,000 of student debt. I'm not sure I'd be standing here today with whatever litanies of experience if I had been burdened by the $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 of student debt that so many young people come out with now. And there are a series of ideas I've got on that, maybe for a different day, but that has to be addressed if we're going to really continue to birth the number of entrepreneurs that we need. But back to my story. I got out, did a little bit in politics, I mentioned, after law school, decided I'd become an entrepreneur. I took my life savings, $5,000, invested it in an energy startup company based here in DC. And Steve, I don't think I've ever told you this. In 6 weeks, I managed to help that company go totally bankrupt. I then went out and tried real estate. And again, kind of a venture background, trying to get pension funds investing in real estate, which was a brand new idea back in 1982. It took me 6 months to fail at that. So at the ripe old age of, I think I was 26 and a half, I had student debt. I was sleeping out of my car, and unlike a lot of my GW classmates and law school classmates, decided I would try it one more time. And got involved in 1982 in this new idea called cellular telephones, which all of my law school classmates who were at all the fanciest firms in town and around the country, to a person said, Warner, go back and get a real job. Nobody's going to want a car telephone. They're all still practicing law and billing in 15-minute increments. So I was lucky enough to catch that wave and ended up starting Nextel and then started a venture capital fund. And the notion of innovation and the notion of entrepreneurship is really what makes, I think, our country unique, makes our country special. There is not this culture in many other countries around the world. Many of the other countries are trying to copy us. But in many ways, it is that secret sauce of entrepreneurship, innovation, I would argue, continuing to attract the best and brightest from around the world, so rational immigration policies, all make America unique and special and need to be maintained. Truth is, in the last 30 years, all of the net new jobs created in America, think about this statistic for a while, and this is done by the Kauffman Foundation, all the net new jobs created in America have been created by startups. The big corporate 500, it may change, but for the most part, they're not growing jobs. Small business in the classic sense of a hardware store or a drugstore, they're not really growing jobs. Where the growth and all the job growth is coming from innovation, coming from entrepreneurship. Now, some of those companies become Under Armour and Google and Facebook, but many of them don't, but there's still a wonderful career path in this field. The challenge is, and one of the things that I've been working on in the Senate, is how do we make this not just happen in a few select areas in our country. Unfortunately, still the vast majority of venture capital still goes to 3 states, and neither one of them are Florida or Virginia. It is California, Massachusetts, and New York, all based around hubs, obviously in the Valley, Boston, New York City. And part of our challenge is, and part of the promise of the information age, I grew up kind of in the 80s and the 90s when we moved from traditional manufacturing more towards an innovation-based economy. Part of the promise was you could build it anywhere. And well, in many ways, we've shown you can build it in Shanghai and Mumbai. We've not done as good a job of showing you can build it, although we do a pretty good job here in Greater Washington, in many of the small communities all across America. And so one of the things I would hope, those of you who are future entrepreneurs in this audience, that you would think about not going to one of those hot spots when you launch your successful venture. And the opportunity to do that in anywhere in the country is now greater than ever. And one of the things I've been trying to do, take a moment for a commercial for Virginia so we can try to keep those stats that Steve mentioned. And by the way, thank you again for what GW has provided to help this effort. In Virginia, we don't have a single market the way Austin has become for Texas or Nashville. And who could have thought Nashville would have emerged in the last 6 or 7 years the way it has in Tennessee? We have a series of communities. We've got obviously this hub of IT and government services and cyber up here in Northern Virginia. I was just 10 days ago at the TomTom Festival in Charlottesville, and I'll make a bold prediction here and say that TomTom in 5 years will be what South by Southwest was 10 years ago, and is really coming on. We've got a great environmental center in Blacksburg and Roanoke, Richmond, Hampton Roads. And what we're trying to do is try to get a network of all these entrepreneurs so we won't perhaps hit critical mass in a single market. But if we can network together all these entrepreneurs to have that reinforcing mentorship programs, and our first project is actually trying to make sure that most essential question, access to capital, is available all over Virginia. So we're really trying to put together the whole capital stack from angel investors to early stage, to Series A, Series B, and then some of the larger funds. So no matter where you are in Virginia, you can get access to capital if you want to try to build it there as opposed to going to, say, to the Valley. That's the good news. What's the challenges? Well, I mentioned one on student debt. I mentioned another on the fact that nobody ever meets their business plan. So while you've got to work on that plan, you got to stay flexible. Number 3 is you've got to recognize no matter how smart you are, no one person can do it all. I would almost always invest in a team over a technology in my 20+ years as a VC. Bet on the team more than the technology because the team will find the way, if they've got a good core of an idea, to actually get there. And I wasn't going to talk politics, and I'm not going to talk politics per se, but I think there is a larger problem that doesn't fit neatly into the Democrat versus Republican kind of political debate that goes on right now. And I say this to you as judges, as community leaders, as GW leaders, but particularly you as entrepreneurs. I have been one of the single biggest beneficiaries of kind of modern American capitalism. You know, I took a chance, failed a couple times, picked myself up, managed to do well. I worry, though, that today in America, modern American capitalism is not working for enough people. And there are 4 areas that I think that I've been trying to get out of my pocket as kind of D versus R and try to step back and think as an entrepreneur about how we would get at some of these problems that may be system-wide. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly, and then as opposed to just listening to a long legislative agenda, would really like to take a couple of your questions. But here's the basis of what 4 areas that I think need some concentration. First is this: the whole notion of what it means to work in many ways is changing. You know, my dad worked for the same company for 38 years. He never made much money, but he always had predictability each year that there was a security of a job and that you'd be able to move forward. I took a slightly different route, had a couple of different careers, but there was still some level of predictability. That kind of future, and I don't want to say this to those of you who are still undergrads, frankly doesn't exist anymore. The percentage of go out, get a job, stay in that same job forever, you know, it is disappearing right before our eyes. And unfortunately what that means, and on one level it's good because it does, as Steve mentioned, I've spent a lot of time around the so-called gig or on-demand economy, and there's great things that come with that flexibility. But it also breeds a huge amount of economic insecurity. Already in America today, in 2017, 1/3 of the workforce is in some level of contingent work. They're either part-time, they're independent contractors, 1099ers, they're gig workers, they're entrepreneurs, and that's, you know, some of that's good, some of that's not so good. But the whole social contract that was set up in the 20th century of social insurance, unemployment, workman's comp, disability, health, retirement, that whole 1/3 of the workforce has none of those benefits, none of that fallback, so that the first time or second time or third time you fail as an entrepreneur, you don't then have nothing to catch you. We got to rethink. So I would argue one of the things that we ought to be doing, and frankly, it probably shouldn't come at the federal level, it needs to come at the local level and the state level, is we ought to be experimenting with portable benefits. We ought to think about a notion, and it shouldn't all have to be run by government by any means, but that notion from that first job, maybe at 16 or 18, to all through your career, for every dollar you make, some portion of that ought to be set aside towards retirement and health and disability. And frankly, in the fintech world, which is one of the most exciting new areas of innovation, we have possibilities to completely recreate a social safety net that meets in the 21st century, an area that would offer a huge amount of entrepreneurial opportunity. The second area is also a result of that changeover from kind of classic traditional work where you work for 30 years for the same firm to where we are today. In today's economy and in today's environment, and we see this with the kind of the disillusion that's taking place not just in our country, but look over at the elections in France that are happening the first round this Sunday, and you see some of the same, is that if you're in the kind of low to mid-range in our economy right now, there's basically no economic incentive for any firm to try to skill you up or train you. You guys who are here, you're going to be probably, by the benefit of being GW students and by being entrepreneurial enough to be here on a beautiful Thursday afternoon, chances are you're going to do fine. But that, again, 1/3 to 50% of the current workforce who's in that low to moderate income stream, it used to be that if they went to work at a firm, they could work there for 30 years, and even if you started at the bottom of the line, you worked hard, you could work your way up. Now, those folks who are at the low to moderate end are the first victims of globalization, technology, and we haven't even started to talk about artificial intelligence. And candidly, a lot of what we've done from the governmental standpoint in terms of workforce training just hasn't worked. So I think we ought to think about how we can re-engage with the business community. I've got a fairly, I wouldn't call radical notion, but the notion is we ought to transfer workforce training for at least low and moderate income people, because you're going to continue to need to upgrade your skills from the government back to business. Maybe change the money you spend on people below a certain income cut line on meaningful training. Certification doesn't all have to be, advanced degrees. And say, you spend money above that baseline on people that make less than $60,000, we'll not give you a tax deduction, we'll give you a tax credit. We'll pay it out over 3 years. And we may have a chance in this year, if we do tax reform, to say to all of the large companies, and I favor repatriation of bringing those earnings that are caught offshore, bring it back, but say you want to bring it back at a really low tax rate? Let's put in place a meaningful training program for low and moderate income people, not just at your firm, but all throughout your supply chain. Third notion, and something that I think is really destructive to some of where we're looking at current capitalism, and that is the chase for short-term profits over long-term value creation. The number of traditional firms, and quite honestly, even as an entrepreneur, successful entrepreneurs, the pressure you may have from VCs or private equity guys that will invest in your companies to, I got to get out at X number of years, that's bad, but that is exponentially worse if you're in the public markets right now. And if you look at the number of public companies and the number of companies going public has dropped dramatically since the late 90s. Some of that is regulatory, but a lot of that is you don't want to be subject to pressure from outside investors to say, if you don't make that 4 cents that next quarter, you are oftentimes forced into, frankly, disinvesting in research, disinvesting in human capital, disinvesting in traditional bricks and mortar. And we see, frankly, for the value of short-term gains, the destruction of long-term value creation. And quite honestly, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we can address that. We could do differential rates on capital gains, we could change the way public companies report, but there are solutions to some of this stuff. And finally, and this is one of the areas that I think is has some of the greatest opportunity, particularly since the Great Recession of 2008 and 9 and 10, and some would say 2017. What we've seen, and it's been driven particularly by millennials, but in addition to millennials, by some of the traditional foundations, there's been a move to say, hey, how do we be pro-free enterprise and pro-capitalism, but recognize that through most of modern American capitalism, businesses had a responsibility, I believe, that they felt yes to their shareholders, but also to a broader set of constituencies, to their employees, to their community. Candidly, I think in a lot of ways, one of the things that was a great governor on business success, excess, not success, was when management and business lived in the same, and workers lived in the same community. Management didn't treat their workers that badly because you didn't want to show up at church or synagogue and suddenly be viewed as a jerk. But when we disaggregate management from workers, we end up seeing different results. And so since 2008 and 9, there's been this growing movement. How many of you ever heard of the B Corp, the benefit corp, B Corp? B Corp, Mike Bloomberg's got something called SASB. There's a guy that was a hedge fund guy who's created something called Just Capital, a ranking system. There's a group called inclusive capitalism, conscientious capitalism. In an age where we measure everything, why couldn't we get, and I've been talking to Ford Foundation and others about, some kind of innovation and entrepreneurship contest for all of these groups, and maybe create a large, $100 million X Prize to say, all you groups who want to go out there, go and find and come together with a single standard. So that pension funds, who are increasingly saying they want to see environmental, social, and governmental changes in terms of investment, so-called ESG, if they want to invest that way and be responsible towards their workers and think on a broader basis, government shouldn't interfere, but let's have a single metric. And what gives me the greatest hope is, quite honestly, those of you who are students. Because I could care less, well, maybe not care less, but I'm not here to argue one side or the other on the political divide. The one thing I found, regardless of where you fall on the political divide amongst the millennials, is they want to work for and buy from companies that have some social value to them. And the notion that we can empower through a marketplace, the only thing that we lack is that common metric. And just maybe, if we could move the political debate from left versus right and Republican versus Democrat to how we actually make capitalism work again in the 21st century, that might be a heck of a lot more productive than what I normally do in my day job. Final comment before a couple questions, and that is, if I was starting out again, where would I look? And I heard about some of the previous winners of this competition. But if I was starting again, I'd be 3 or 4 areas. One, good and bad, but cyber in all its aspects is going to be with us for as far as the eye can see. And whether it's cyber protections, whether it's cyber advising, whether it's just rethinking the whole role of the platform companies in terms of whether they have any responsibility to curate some of the information that comes over them, huge, huge area. I think we're going to move from the apps-driven world that has flourished so much over the last 15 years to a much more kind of cyber-driven, big data, social responsibility would be one bucket. Second would be unmanned systems. Unmanned systems is going to be huge. I remember I got rich on cell phones because back in the 1980s, when I invested and got started, all of the banks and all of the telcos thought it would take 30 years to build out one cell phone network in America, and at the end of that 30 years, 5% of Americans would have cell phones. They were wrong. The same predictions, I believe, are going to come true with unmanned systems. Whether it is the fact that we sold 1 million drones last year in America, unfortunately not a single one of them were made in America. The fact that we're going to have delivery. We did the first actually burrito delivery from a drone at Virginia Tech earlier this year, but that's going to come around. Unmanned cars, other kind of maritime systems, huge, huge opportunity. Third area is, how do you bring big data to government? Frankly, it probably won't happen at the federal level to start, but if I was going to be, especially coming out of a GW where you've got so much exposure to the public policy side as well as the entrepreneurship side, how do you mesh big data with the notion of smart cities? Frankly, there's no place better than George Washington to have that combination from kind of the engineering, technical, and policy standpoint. And for cities that are always looking, and localities are always looking for revenue and ways to attract you as entrepreneurs, making cities more kind of user-friendly, consumer-friendly, great, great opportunity. And then finally, the area that both has huge opportunity, but huge frightening implications that I don't think policymakers and candidly even some of the entrepreneurs have fully thought through, and that's artificial intelligence and machine learning. And again, this is going to be at us in a way that's a lot quicker than almost anyone, I think, in the policy world will predict. But if that comes to pass, if we don't get ourselves back to the point where we think the free enterprise system, that enough people buy into it, and that the notion that capitalism can actually work for the vast majority of Americans, then we're not going to have the kind of country that allowed me to fail a number of times and then stand up here and talk to you, and frankly, allow you the chance to kind of get out and grow the kind of vision and business that you have, to make you great, but also to continue to make our country great. So again, Steve, thank you for the opportunity. I know you're going to start up others, but let me just take 1 or 2 questions before I get off the stage or get out of Dodge. Yes?
Thank you for coming in from Williamsburg, Virginia, by the way.
All right.
The question has to do with a term that's very common. It's sustainability. How does sustainability, it's hard to measure it. So how does that play a role in a tangible product or what you're talking about? Technology, is it a hindrance? Is it an opportunity for entrepreneurs?
Great question. And that's where, and great question, I don't have a full answer. One of the areas, and because sustainability falls into that kind of new category post-Great Recession, when we look at what does it mean to be conscientious capitalist? What does it mean to be a B Corp? What does it mean SASB, which is supposed to be the sustainability index being created? We don't have a common metric. So the idea of, and if we allow that, we're going to say, we're going to take the market to figure this out without a nudge, I think we could be in a really dark space, both from an environmental standpoint, from a social, societal standpoint, from a governance standpoint. So that's why I would encourage, I may not have the answer on sustainability. I do think it's valuable, but I do think we need some metric around it. If it continues to be kind of squish, and I say this is from a state where sea level rise right now cancels one church about once a week in Norfolk because of those rising sea levels. This is the real deal. But we don't have a metric there, I think, that really makes sense. Yes, sir.
So you spoke about 75% of the venture capital going to 3 states, 3 cities actually, the hubs around there. So what do you think is the catalyst? What will make that change over the next 5-10 years? And when you see the DMV area
Well, I think
fitting in that change?
I think the Valley, I don't want to be critical there, but I think the Valley has gotten so caught up in its own stuff at this point, and costs are getting so outrageous for all but the most successful entrepreneurs. And candidly, it's still built mostly on an app-driven world that I don't think is where necessarily all the future is going to lie. Obviously, the new standards like Google and Facebook are trying to get into new areas, whether it's unmanned or whether it's AI. So I don't think the traditional leader community necessarily is going to be guaranteed to be the leader for the next 20 years. I think Steve Case has done some of the best work in this space, called The Rise of the Rest, his tour. On how you do that, I think what communities need to do is present an attractive living space, because the net migration towards cities is huge. I think the DMV has got a huge opportunity. We need a few more wins. I mean, the only kind of mega win we've had in this market in the last 25 years, I would argue, is still AOL. We've had lots of mid-level wins, but we need a couple more. And part of that as well means those of us, I'm no longer that us, I'm one of them, I guess, but in the venture capital community, need to do more to kind of incite those winning companies to stay. There's a couple of the cyber companies that grew up in this region and then got acquired or moved off to the Valley. Some of those very cyber leaders, I think we could bring back here, because that's going to be a huge space. And I think that's probably one of the spaces that offer the most opportunity. Anything that intersects with public policy, frankly, we're going to have an advantage on. Cyber will, unmanned systems will, smart cities will, all areas. I'll take one last one, then get out of your hair. Yes?
I think the solutions that you suggested for the shortcomings of capitalism is very appropriate, but I think you would agree that it requires a certain amount of authority to implement those. So I'm wondering when you would consider moving to that little house that has a lot of authority to implement these changes?
That's a political question. I'm not going to answer any of those. No, listen, I think, now the question was, he was asking me if I was looking at other political things. And no, I got a job that's, the thing in the Senate that we need is we need more entrepreneurship. Too many of the folks in both political parties didn't come to these jobs by being entrepreneurs. And I say that respectfully. Anybody who's ever run for political office, especially in modern America, whether they win or lose, I mean, they are at least at one level an entrepreneur, and they at least are brave. But it's not the kind of necessary risk-taking that you take in a entrepreneurial world. And we've been so caught. One of the challenges I think we've got right now is if we simply redebate healthcare and tax reform and infrastructure with all the same old solution sets, everybody knows what everybody's position is already. If we don't change the frame of the argument, unless we completely clean house in Congress, you've got to come at these problems in a different way if we're not solving them in our current frame. So if we come at fixing capitalism, I think you can probably get at least 80% of the Congress to agree that that would be a worthy goal. And if you think about portable benefits, or if you think about investment in workforce training and low and moderate skilled people, if you think about long-term value creation versus short-term wins, if you think about outside metrics on some levels of social responsibility, I don't have the foggiest idea whether those are Democrat or Republican ideas. They are more future past. And what I feel like sometimes both political parties are doing right now is they are backwards looking. The Democrats might be looking back towards 1930s solutions, and the president may be looking back at an image of 1950s America that may or may not have been fully true. America has always been at its best when we've been forward-leaning. And I think what is, I will close with this, and That's why I'm so proud to be a GW alum. GW has always been forward-leading. It's been very much more so under Steve's leadership and the kind of project that you all are participating in tonight. If we keep this kind of innovation going, we keep this kind of entrepreneurship going, then the future will be bright for our country. But we need to take that same kind of thinking into the policy realm. So again, regardless of where you fall in the political aisle, my one ask of all of you entrepreneurs is it is too important what government does to simply leave it to the politicians. So you cannot opt out of being engaged. Yeah, go make your business, go save the world. But if you don't be involved as well in the political system, all you do is turn the keys over to the wingnuts, and that on both ends of the political spectrum. That's a technical political term. You have to study politics for a long time to understand that. And that's not the country we want, and that's not the country you want to build your businesses in. Thank you all very much.